This is the Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, by Benjamin Franklin, which is a public domain work. XE8. Scientific experiments. Before I proceed in relating the part one had in public affairs under this new governor's administration, it may not be amiss here to give some account of the rise and progress of my philosophical reputation. In 1746, being at Boston, I met there with a Dr. Spence, who was lately arrived from Scotland, and showed me some electric experiments. They were imperfectly performed, as he was not very expert, but, being on a subject quite new to me, they equally surprised and pleased me. Soon after my return to Philadelphia, our library company received from Mr. P. Collinson, Fellow of the Royal Society of London, a present of a glass tube, with some account of the use of it in making such experiments. I eagerly seized the opportunity of repeating what I had seen at Boston, and, by much practice, acquired great readiness in performing those, also, which we had an account of from England, adding a number of new ones. I say much practice, for my house was continually full, for some time, with people who came to see these new wonders. To divide a little this encumbrance among my friends, I caused a number of similar tubes to be blown at our glass house, with which they furnished themselves, so that we had at length several performers. Among these, the principal was Mr. Kinnersley, an ingenious neighbour, who, being out of business, I encouraged to undertake showing the experiments for money, and drew up for him 2 lectures, in which the experiments were ranged in such order, and accompanied with such explanations in such method, as that the foregoing should assist in comprehending the following. He procured an elegant apparatus for the purpose, in which all the little machines that I had roughly made for myself were nicely formed by instrument makers. His lectures were well attended, and gave great satisfaction, and after some time he went through the colonies, exhibiting them in every capital town, and picked up some money. In the West India Islands, indeed, it was with difficulty the experiments could be made, from the general moisture of the air. Obliged as we were to Mr. Collinson for his present of the tube, and so on, I thought it right he should be informed of our success in using it, and wrote him several letters containing accounts of our experiments. He got them read in the Royal Society, where they were not at first thought worth so much notice as to be printed in their transactions. In one paper, which I wrote for Mr. Kinnersley, on the sameness of lightning with electricity, I sent to Dr. Mitchell, an acquaintance of mine, and one of the members also of that society, who wrote me word that it had been read, but was laughed at by the connoisseurs. And the papers, however, being shown to Dr. Fothergill, he thought them of too much value to be stifled, and advised the printing of them. Mr. Collinson then gave them to Cave for publication in his Gentleman's Magazine, but he chose to print them separately in a pamphlet, and Dr. Fothergill wrote the preface. Cave, it seems, judged rightly for his profit, for by the editions that arrived afterward they swelled to a 1/4 volume, which has had 5 editions, and cost him nothing for copy money. It was, however, some time before those papers were much taken notice of in England. A copy of them happening to fall into the hands of the Count de Buffon, a philosopher deservedly of great reputation in France, and, indeed, all over Europe, he prevailed with Monsieur Dalibard to translate them into French, and they were printed at Paris. The publication offended the Abbé Nollet, preceptor in natural philosophy to the royal family, and an able experimenter who had formed and published a theory of electricity, which then had the general vogue. He could not at first believe that such a work came from America, and said it must have been fabricated by his enemies at Paris to decry his system. Afterwards, having been assured that there really existed such a person as Franklin at Philadelphia, which he had doubted, he wrote and published a volume of letters, chiefly addressed to me, defending his theory and denying the verity of my experiments and of the positions deduced from them. I once purposed answering the Abbé, and actually began the answer, but on consideration that my writings contained a description of experiments which anyone might repeat and verify, and if not to be verified could not be defended, or of observations offered as conjectures, and not delivered dogmatically, therefore not laying me under any obligation to defend them, and reflecting that a dispute between 2 persons, writing in different languages, might be lengthened greatly by mistranslations, and thence misconceptions of one another's meaning, much of one of the Abbé's letters being founded on an error in the translation, I concluded to let my papers shift for themselves, believing it was better to spend what time I could spare from public business in making new experiments than in disputing about those already made. I therefore never answered M. Nollet, and the event gave me no cause to repent my silence, for my friend M. Leroy, of the Royal Academy of Sciences, took up my cause and refuted him. My book was translated into the Italian, German, and Latin languages, and the doctrine it contained was by degrees universally adopted by the philosophers of Europe in preference to that of the Abbé, so that he lived to see himself the last of his sect, except Monsieur B. of Paris, his élève and immediate disciple. What gave my book the more sudden and general celebrity was the success of one of its proposed experiments made by Messrs. Dalibard and Delort Marly for drawing lightning from the clouds. This engaged the public attention everywhere. M. and Delort, who had an apparatus for experimental philosophy and lectured in that branch of science, undertook to repeat what he called the Philadelphia experiments, and, after they were performed before the king and court, all the curious of Paris flocked to see them. I will not swell this narrative with an account of that capital experiment, nor of the infinite pleasure I received in the success of a similar one I made soon after with a kite at Philadelphia, as both are to be found in the histories of electricity. Dr. Wright, an English physician, when at Paris, wrote to a friend who was of the Royal Society an account of the high esteem my experiments were in among the learned abroad, and of their wonder that my writings had been so little noticed in England. The Society, on this, resumed the consideration of the letters that had been read to them, and the celebrated Dr. Watson drew up a summary account of them, and of all I had afterwards sent to England on the subject, which he accompanied with some praise of the writer. This summary was then printed in their Transactions, and some members of the Society in London, particularly the very ingenious Mr. Canton, having verified the experiment of procuring lightning from the clouds by a pointed rod, and acquainting them with the success, they soon made me more than amends for the slight with which they had before treated me. Without my having made any application for that honour, they chose me a member, and voted that I should be excused the customary payments, which would have amounted to 25 guineas, and ever since have given me their Transactions gratis. They also presented me with the gold medal of Sir Godfrey Copley for the year 1753, the delivery of which was accompanied by a very handsome speech of the President, Lord Macclesfield, wherein I was highly honoured. 7 Minute. Agent O.F. Pennsylvania, I.N. London. Our new governor, Captain Denny, brought over for me the before-mentioned medal from the Royal Society, which he presented to me at an entertainment given him by the city. He accompanied it with very polite expressions of his esteem for me, having, as he said, been long acquainted with my character. After dinner, when the company, as was customary at that time, were engaged in drinking, he took me aside into another room and acquainted me that he had been advised by his friends in England to cultivate a friendship with me, as one who was capable of giving him the best advice and of contributing most effectually to the making his administration easy, that he therefore desired of all things to have a good understanding with me, and he begged me to be assured of his readiness on all occasions to render me every service that might be in his power. He said much to me, also, of the proprietor's good disposition towards the province, and of the advantage it might be to us all, and to me in particular, if the opposition that had been so long continued to his measures was dropped, and harmony restored between him and the people, in effecting which, it was thought no one could be more serviceable than myself, and I might depend on adequate acknowledgments and recompenses. And so on the drinkers, finding we did not return immediately to the table, sent us a decanter of Madeira, which the governor made use of, and in proportion became more profuse of his solicitations and promises. My answers were to this purpose, that my circumstances, thanks to God, were such as to make proprietary favours unnecessary to me, and that, being a member of the Assembly, I could not possibly accept of any. That, however, I had no personal enmity to the proprietary, and that, whenever the public measures he proposed should appear to be for the good of the people, no one should espouse and forward them more zealously than myself, my past opposition having been founded on this, that the measures which had been urged were evidently intended to serve the proprietary interest, with great prejudice to that of the people, that I was much obliged to him, the governor, for his professions of regard to me, and that he might rely on everything in my power to make his administration as easy as possible, hoping at the same time that he had not brought with him the same unfortunate instruction his predecessor had been hampered with. On this he did not then explain himself, but when he afterwards came to do business with the Assembly, they appeared again. The disputes were renewed, and I was as active as ever in the opposition, being the penman first of the request to have a communication of the instructions, and then of the remarks upon them, which may be found in the votes of the time, and in the historical review I afterward published. But between us personally no enmity arose, We were often together. He was a man of letters, had seen much of the world, and was very entertaining and pleasing in conversation. He gave me the first information that my old friend Ralph was still alive, that he was esteemed one of the best political writers in England, had been employed in the dispute between Prince Frederick and the King, and had obtained a pension of 300 a year, that his reputation was indeed small as a poet, Pope having damned his poetry in the Dunciad, but his prose was thought as good as any man's. The Assembly, finally finding the Proprietary obstinately persisted in manacling their deputies with instructions inconsistent not only with the privileges of the people, but with the service of the Crown, resolved to petition the King against them, and appointed me their agent to go over to England, to present and support the petition. The House had sent up a bill to the Governor, granting a sum of £60,000 for the King's use, £10,000 of which was subjected to the orders of the then General, Lord Loudoun, which the Governor absolutely refused to pass, in compliance with his instructions. I had agreed with Captain Morris, of the packet at New York, for my passage, and my stores were put on board, when Lord Loudoun arrived at Philadelphia, expressly, as he told me, to endeavour an accommodation between the Governor and Assembly, that His Majesty's service might not be obstructed by their dissensions. Accordingly, he desired the Governor and myself to meet him, that he might hear what was to be said on both sides. We met and discussed the business. In behalf of the Assembly, I urged all the various arguments that may be found in the public papers of that time, which were of my writing, and are printed with the minutes of the Assembly, and the Governor pleaded his instructions, the bond he had given to observe them, and his ruin if he disobeyed, yet seemed not unwilling to hazard himself if Lord Loudoun would advise it. This his lordship did not choose to do, though I once thought I had nearly prevailed with him to do it. But finally he rather chose to urge the compliance of the Assembly, and he entreated me to use my endeavours with them for that purpose, declaring that he would spare none of the King's troops for the defence of our frontiers, and that, if we did not continue to provide for that defence ourselves, they must remain exposed to the enemy. I acquainted the House with what had passed, and, presenting them with a set of resolutions I had drawn up, declaring our rights, and that we did not relinquish our claim to those rights, but only suspended the exercise of them on this occasion through force, against which we protested, they at length agreed to drop that bill and frame another conformable to the proprietary instructions. This, of course, the Governor passed, and I was then at liberty to proceed on my voyage. But, in the meantime, the packet had sailed with my sea stores, which was some loss to me, and my only recompense was his lordship's thanks for my service, all the credit of obtaining the accommodation falling to his share. He set out for New York before me, and, as the time for dispatching the packet boats was at his disposition, and there were 2 then remaining there, one of which, he said, was to sail very soon, I requested to know the precise time, that I might not miss her by any delay of mine. His answer was, I have given out that she is to sail on Saturday next, but I may let you know, entre nous, that if you are there by Monday morning you will be in time, but do not delay longer. By some accidental hindrance at a ferry, it was Monday noon before I arrived, and I was much afraid she might have sailed, as the wind was fair. But I was soon made easy by the information that she was still in the harbour, and would not move till the next day. One would imagine that I was now on the very point of departing for Europe. I thought so, but I was not then so well acquainted with his lordship's character, of which indecision was one of the strongest features. I shall give some instances. It was about the beginning of April that I came to New York, and I think it was near the end of June before we sailed. There were then 2 of the packet, boats which had been long in port, but were detained for the General's letters, which were always to be ready tomorrow. Another packet arrived, she too was detained, and, before we sailed, a 4th was expected. Ours was the first to be dispatched, as having been their longest. Passengers were engaged in all, and some extremely impatient to be gone, and the merchants uneasy about their letters, and the orders they had given for insurance, it being wartime for full goods, but their anxiety availed nothing. His lordship's letters were not ready, and yet whoever waited on him found him always at his desk, pen in hand, and concluded he must needs write abundantly. Going myself one morning to pay my respects, I found in his antechamber one Innes, a messenger of Philadelphia, who had come from thence express with a packet from Governor Denny for the General. He delivered to me some letters from my friends there, which occasioned my inquiring when he was to return, and where he lodged, that I might send some letters by him. He told me he was ordered to call tomorrow at 9 for the General's answer to the Governor, and should set off immediately. I put my letters into his hands the same day. A fortnight after I met him again in the same place. So, You are soon returned, Innes? Returned? No, I am not gone yet. How so? I have called here by order every morning these 2 weeks past for his lordship's letter, and it is not yet ready. Is it possible when he is so great a writer? For I see him constantly at his escritoire. Yes, says Innes, but he is like Stane George on the signs, always on horseback, and never rides on. This observation of the messenger was, it seems, well-founded, for, when in England, I understood that Mr. Pitt gave it as one reason for removing this general and sending Generals Amherst and Wolfe that the minister never heard from him, and could not know what he was doing. This daily expectation of sailing, and all the 3 packets going down to Sandy Hook to join the fleet there. The passengers thought it best to be on board, lest by a sudden order the ship should sail, and they be left behind. There, if I remember right, we were about 6 weeks consuming our sea stores, and obliged to procure more. At length, the fleet sailed, the general and all his army on board, bound to Louisbourg, with the intent to besiege and take that fortress, all the packet boats in company ordered to attend the general's ship, ready to receive his dispatches when they should be ready. We were out 5 days before we got a letter with leave to part, and then our ship quitted the fleet and steered for England. The other 2 packets he still detained, carried them with him to Halifax, where he stayed some time to exercise the men in sham attacks upon sham forts, then altered his mind as to besieging Louisbourg, and returned to New York with all his troops, together with the 2 packets above mentioned and all their passengers. During his absence the French and savages had taken Fort George, on the frontier of that province, and the savages had massacred many of the garrison after capitulation. I saw afterwards in London Captain Bonnell, who commanded one of those packets. He told me that, when he had been detained a month, he acquainted his lordship that his ship was grown foul, to a degree that must necessarily hinder her fast sailing, a point of consequence for a packet-boat, and requested an allowance of time to heave her down and clean her bottom. He was asked how long time that would require. He answered, 3 days. The general replied, "If you can do it in 1 day, I give leave, otherwise not, for you must certainly sail the day after tomorrow." So he never obtained leave, though detained afterwards from day to day during full 3 months. I saw also in London one of Bonnell's passengers, who was so enraged against his lordship for deceiving and detaining him so long at New York, and then carrying him to Halifax and back again, that he swore he would sue him for damages. Whether he did or not, I never heard, but, as he represented the injury to his affairs, it was very considerable. On the whole, I wondered much how such a man came to be entrusted with so important a business as the conduct of a great army, but, having since seen more of the great world, and the means of obtaining, and motives for giving places, my wonder is diminished. General Shirley, on whom the command of the army devolved upon the death of Braddock, would, in my opinion, if continued in place, have made a much better campaign than that of Loudoun in 1757, which was frivolous, expensive, and disgraceful to our nation beyond conception. For, though Shirley was not a bred soldier, he was sensible and sagacious in himself, and attentive to good advice from others, capable of forming judicious plans, and quick and active in carrying them into execution. Loudoun, instead of defending the colonies with his great army, left them totally exposed while he paraded idly at Halifax, by which means Fort George was lost. Besides, he deranged all our mercantile operations, and distressed our trade by a long embargo on the exportation of provisions, on pretence of keeping supplies from being obtained by the enemy, but in reality for beating down their price in favour of the contractors, in whose profits, it was said, perhaps from suspicion only, he had a share. And, when at length the embargo was taken off, by neglecting to send notice of it to Charlestown, the Carolina fleet was detained near 3 months longer, whereby their bottoms were so much damaged by the worm that a great part of them foundered in their passage home. Shirley was, I believe, sincerely glad of being relieved from so burdensome a charge as the conduct of an army must be to a man unacquainted with military business. I was at the entertainment given by the city of New York to Lord Loudoun on his taking upon him the command. Shirley, though thereby superseded, was present also. There was a great company of officers, citizens, and strangers, and, some chairs having been borrowed in the neighbourhood, there was one among them very low, which fell to the lot at Mr. Shirley. Perceiving it as I sat by him, I said, "They have given you, sir, too low a seat." "No matter," says he, "Mr. Franklin, I find a low seat the easiest. While I was, as aforementioned, detained at New York, I received all the accounts of the provisions and so on that I had furnished to Braddock. some of which accounts could not sooner be obtained from the different persons I had employed to assist in the business. I presented them to Lord Loudoun, desiring to be paid the balance. He caused them to be regularly examined by the proper officer, who, after comparing every article with its voucher, certified them to be right, and the balance due, for which his lordship promised to give me an order on the paymaster. This was, however, put off from time to time, and though I called often for it by appointment, I did not get it. At length, just before my departure, he told me he had, on better consideration, concluded not to mix his accounts with those of his predecessors. "And you," says he, "when in England, have only to exhibit your accounts at the Treasury, and you will be paid immediately." I mentioned, but without effect, the great and unexpected expense I had been put to by being detained so long at New York, as a reason for my desiring to be presently paid, and on my observing that it was not right I should be put to any further trouble or delay in obtaining the money I had advanced, as I charged no commission for my service. "Oh, sir," says he, "you must not think of persuading us that you are no gainer. We understand better those affairs, and know that everyone concerned in supplying the army finds means, in the doing it, to fill his own pockets." I assured him that was not my case, and that I had not pocketed a farthing, but he appeared clearly not to believe me, and, indeed, I have since learnt that immense fortunes are often made in such employments. As to my balance, I am not paid it to this day, of which more hereafter. Our captain of the packet had boasted much, before we sailed, of the swiftness of his ship. Unfortunately, when we came to sea, she proved the dullest of 96 sail, to his no small mortification. After many conjectures respecting the cause, when we were near another ship almost as dull as ours, which, however, gained upon us, the captain ordered all hands to come aft and stand as near the ensign's staff as possible. We were, passengers included, about 40 persons. While we stood there, the ship mended her pace and soon left her neighbour far behind, which proved clearly what our captain suspected, that she was loaded too much by the head. The casks of water, it seems, had been all placed forward. These he therefore ordered to be moved further aft, on which the ship recovered her character, and proved the best sailor in the fleet. The captain said she had once gone at the rate of 13 knots, which is accounted 13 miles per hour. We had on board, as a passenger, Captain Kennedy, of the Navy, who contended that it was impossible, and that no ship ever sailed so fast, and that there must have been some error in the division of the log line, or some mistake in heaving the log. A wager ensued between the two captains, to be decided when there should be sufficient wind. Kennedy thereupon examined rigorously the log line, and, being satisfied with that, he determined to throw the log himself. Accordingly, some days after, when the wind blew very fair and fresh, and the captain of the packet, Lutwidge, said he, believed she then went at the rate of 13 knots, Kennedy made the experiment, and owned his wager lost. The above fact I give for the sake of the following observation. It has been remarked, as an imperfection in the art of shipbuilding, that it can never be known till she is tried, whether a new ship will or will not be a good sailor, for that the model of a good sailing ship has been exactly followed in a new one, which has proved, on the contrary, remarkably dull. I apprehend that this may partly be occasioned by the different opinions of seamen respecting the modes of lading, rigging, and sailing of a ship. Each has his system, and the same vessel, laden by the judgment and orders of one captain, shall sail better or worse than when by the orders of another. Besides, it scarce ever happens that a ship is formed, fitted for the sea, and sailed by the same person. One man builds the hull, another rigs her, a third lades and sails her. No one of these has the advantage of knowing all the ideas and experience of the others, and therefore cannot draw just conclusions from a combination of the whole. Even in the simple operation of sailing when at sea, I have often observed different judgments in the officers who commanded the successive watches, the wind being the same. One would have the sails trimmed sharper or flatter than another, so that they seem to have no certain rule to govern by. Yet I think a set of experiments might be instituted, first, to determine the most proper form of the hull for swift sailing, next, the best dimensions and properest place for the masts, then the form and quantity of sails, and their position, as the wind may be, and, lastly, the disposition of the lading. This is an age of experiments, and I think a set accurately made and combined would be of great use. I am persuaded, therefore, that ere long some ingenious philosopher will undertake it, to whom I wish success. We were several times chassed in our passage, but outsailed everything, and in 30 days had soundings. We had a good observation, and the captain judged himself so near our port, Falmouth, that, if we made a good run in the night, we might be off the mouth of that harbour in the morning, and by running in the night might escape the notice of the enemy's privateers, who often cruised near the entrance of the channel. Accordingly, all the sail was set that we could possibly make, and the wind being very fresh and fair, we went right before it and made great way. The captain, after his observation, shapped his course, as he thought, so as to pass wide of the Scilly Isles. But it seems there is sometimes a strong indraught setting up St. George's Channel, which deceives seamen and caused the loss of Sir Cloudesley Shovel's squadron. This indraught was probably the cause of what happened to us. I had a watchman placed in the bow, to whom they often called, "Look well out before there," and he as often answered, "Aye," but perhaps had his eyes shut, and was half asleep at the time, they sometimes answering, as is said, mechanically, for he did not see a light just before us, which had been hid by the studding sails from the man at the helm, and from the rest of the watch, but by an accidental yaw of the ship was discovered, and occasioned a great alarm, we being very near it, the light appearing to me as big as a cartwheel. It was midnight, and our captain fast asleep, but Captain Kennedy, jumping upon deck and seeing the danger, ordered the ship to wear round, all sails standing, an operation dangerous to the masts, but it carried us clear, and we escaped shipwreck, for we were running right upon the rocks on which the lighthouse was erected. This deliverance impressed me strongly with the utility of lighthouses, and made me resolve to encourage the building more of them in America, if I should live to return there. In the morning, it was found by the soundings, and so on, that we were near our port, but a thick fog hid the land from our sight. About 9 o'clock the fog began to rise, and seemed to be lifted up from the water like the curtain at a playhouse, discovering underneath the town of Falmouth, the vessels in its harbour, and the fields that surrounded it. This was a most pleasing spectacle to those who had been so long without any other prospects than the uniform view of a vacant ocean, and it gave us the more pleasure as we were now free from the anxieties which the state of war occasioned. I set out immediately, with my son, for London, and we only stopped a little by the way to view Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain, and Lord Pembroke's house and gardens, with his very curious antiquities at Wilton. We arrived in London the 27th of July, 1757. As soon as I was settled in a lodging Mr. Charles had provided for me, I went to visit Dr. Fothergill, to whom I was strongly recommended, and whose counsel respecting my proceedings I was advised to obtain. He was against an immediate complaint to government, and thought the proprietaries should first be personally applied to, who might possibly be induced by the interposition and persuasion of some private friends to accommodate matters amicably. I then waited on my old friend and correspondent, Mr. Peter Collinson, who told me that John Hanbury, the great Virginia merchant, had requested to be informed when I should arrive, that he might carry me to Lord Granville's, who was then President of the Council, and wished to see me as soon as possible. I agreed to go with him the next morning. Accordingly, Mr. Hanbury called for me, and took me in his carriage to that nobleman's, who received me with great civility, and after some questions respecting the present state of affairs in America and discourse thereupon, he said to me, "You Americans have wrong ideas of the nature of your constitution. You contend that the king's instructions to his governors are not laws, and think yourselves at liberty to regard or disregard them at your own discretion. But those instructions are not like the pocket instructions given to a minister going abroad for regulating his conduct in some trifling point of ceremony. They are first drawn up by judges learned in the laws. They are then considered, debated, and perhaps amended in council, after which they are signed by the king. They are then, so far as they relate to you, the law of the land, for the king is the legislator of the colonies." I told his lordship. This was new doctrine to me. I had always understood from our charters that our laws were to be made by our assemblies, to be presented indeed to the king for his royal assent, but that being once given the king could not repeal or alter them. And as the assemblies could not make permanent laws without his assent, so neither could he make a law for them without theirs. He assured me I was totally mistaken. I did not think so, however, and his lordship's conversation having a little alarmed me as to what might be the sentiments of the court concerning us, I wrote it down as soon as I returned to my lodgings. I recollected that about 20 years before, a clause in a bill brought into Parliament by the Ministry had proposed to make the King's instructions laws in the colonies, but the clause was thrown out by the Commons, for which we adored them as our friends and friends of liberty, till by their conduct towards us in 1765 it seemed that they had refused that point of sovereignty to the King, only that they might reserve it for themselves. After some days, Dr. Fothergill having spoken to the proprietaries, they agreed to a meeting with me at Mr. T. Penn's house in Spring Garden. The conversation at first consisted of mutual declarations of disposition to reasonable accommodations, but I suppose each party had its own ideas of what should be meant by reasonable. We then went into consideration of our several points of complaint, which I enumerated. The proprietaries justified their conduct as well as they could, and I the Assembly's. We now appeared very wide, and so far from each other in our opinions as to discourage all hope of agreement. However, it was concluded that I should give them the heads of our complaints in writing, and they promised then to consider them. I did so soon after, but they put the paper into the hands of their solicitor, Ferdinand John Paris, who managed for them all their law business in their great suit with the neighbouring proprietary of Maryland, Lord Baltimore, which had subsisted 70 years, and wrote for them all their papers and messages in their dispute with the Assembly. He was a proud, angry man, and as I had occasionally in the answers of the Assembly treated his papers with some severity, they being really weak in point of argument and haughty in expression, he had conceived a mortal enmity to me, which, discovering itself whenever we met, I declined the proprietary's proposal that he and I should discuss the heads of complaint between our two selves, and refused treating with anyone but them. They then, by his advice, put the paper into the hands of the Attorney and Solicitor General for their opinion and counsel upon it, where it lay unanswered a year wanting 8 days, during which time I made frequent demands of an answer from the proprietaries, but without obtaining any other than that they had not yet received the opinion of the Attorney and Solicitor General. What it was when they did receive it, I never learnt, for they did not communicate it to me, but sent a long message to the Assembly drawn and signed by Paris, reciting my paper, complaining of its want of formality as a rudeness on my part, and giving a flimsy justification of their conduct, adding that they should be willing to accommodate matters if the Assembly would send out some person of candour to treat with them for that purpose, intimating thereby that I was not such. The want of formality or rudeness was, probably, my not having addressed the paper to them with their assumed titles of true and absolute proprietaries of the province of Pennsylvania, which I omitted as not thinking it necessary in a paper, the intention of which was only to reduce to a certainty by writing, what in conversation I had delivered viva voce. But during this delay, the Assembly having prevailed with Governor to pass an act taxing the proprietary estate in common with the estates of the people, which was the grand point in dispute, they omitted answering the message. When this act, however, came over, the proprietaries, counselled by Paris, determined to oppose its receiving the royal assent. Accordingly, they petitioned the King in council, and a hearing was appointed in which 2 lawyers were employed by them against the act, and 2 by me in support of it. They auled that the act was intended to load the proprietary estate in order to spare those of the people, and that if it was suffered to continue in force, and the proprietaries, who were in odium with the people, left to their mercy in proportioning the taxes, they would inevitably be ruined. We replied that the act had no such intention, and would have no such effect. That the assessors were honest and discreet men under an oath to assess fairly and equitably, and that any advantage each of them might expect in lessening his own tax by augmenting that of the proprietaries was too trifling to induce them to perjure themselves. This is the purport of what I remember as urged by both sides, except that we insisted strongly on the mischievous consequences that must attend a repeal, for that the money, 100,000, being printed and given to the King's use, expended in his service, and now spread among the people, the repeal would strike it dead in their hands to the ruin of many, and the total discouragement of future grants, and the selfishness of the proprietors in soliciting such a general catastrophe, merely from a groundless fear of their estate being taxed too highly, was insisted on in the strongest terms. On this, Lord Mansfield, one of the council, rose, and beckoning me, took me into the clerk's chamber, while the lawyers were pleading, and asked me if I was really of opinion that no injury would be done the proprietary estate in the execution of the act. I said certainly. Then, says he, you can have little objection to enter into an engagement to assure that point. I answered, none at all. He then called in Paris, and after some discourse his lordship's proposition was accepted on both sides. A paper to the purpose was drawn up by the clerk of the council, which I signed of Mr. Charles, who was also an agent of the province for their ordinary affairs. When Lord Mansfield returned to the council chamber, where finally the law was allowed to pass. Some changes were, however, recommended, and we also engaged they should be made by a subsequent law. But the Assembly did not think them necessary. For 1 year's tax having been levied by the Act before the Order of Council arrived, they appointed a committee to examine the proceedings of the assessors, and on this committee they put several particular friends of the proprietaries. After a full inquiry, they unanimously signed a report that they found the tax had been assessed with perfect equity. The Assembly looked into my entering into the first part of the engagement as an essential service to the province, since it secured the credit of the paper money then spread over all the country. They gave me their thanks in form when I returned. The proprietaries were enraged at Governor Denny for having passed the Act, and turned him out with threats of suing him for breach of instructions which he had given Bond to observe. He, however, having done it at the instance of the General, and for His Majesty's service, and having some powerful interest at court, dispised the threats, and they were never put in execution. Unfinished. Appendix. Electrical Kite to Peter Collinson, Philadelphia, Oct. 19, 1752. Sir, as frequent mention is made in public papers from Europe of the success of the Philadelphia experiment for drawing the electric fire from clouds by means of pointed rods of iron erected on high buildings, &c., it may be agreeable to the curious to be informed that the same experiment has succeeded in Philadelphia, though made in a different and more easy manner, which is as follows. Make a small cross of 2 light strips of cedar, the arms so long as to reach to the 4 corners of a large thin silk handkerchief when extended. Tie the corners of the handkerchief to the extremities of the cross, so you have the body of a kite, which being properly accommodated with a tail, loop, and string, will rise in the air, like those made of paper. But this being of silk, is fitter to bear the wet and wind of a thunder gust without tearing. To the top of the upright stick of the cross is to be fixed a very sharp pointed wire, rising a foot or more above the wood. To the end of the twine, next the hand, is to be tied a silk ribbon, and where the silk and twine join, a key may be fastened. This kite is to be raised when a thunder gust appears to be coming on, and the person who holds the string must stand within a door or window, or under some cover, so that the silk ribbon may not be wet, and care must be taken that the twine does not touch the frame of the door or window. As soon as any of the thunderclouds come over the kite, the pointed wire will draw the electric fire from them, and the kite, with all the twine, will be electrified, and the loose filaments of the twine will stand out every way and be attracted by an approaching finger. And when the rain has wet the kite and twine, so that it can conduct the electric fire freely, you will find it stream out plentifully from the key on the approach of your knuckle. At this key the file may be charged, and from electric fire thus obtained, spirits may be kindled, and all the electric experiments be performed, which are usually done by the help of a rubbed glass globe or tube, and thereby the sameness of the electric matter with that of lightning completely demonstrated. B. Franklin. From Father Abraham's Speech, 1760. Reproduced from a copy at the New York Public Library. Theaito Welf. From Father Abraham's Speech, forming the preface to Poor Richard's Almanac for 1758. It would be thought a hard government that should tax its people 1/10 part of their time to be employed in its service. But idleness taxes many of us much more, if we reckon all that is spent in absolute sloth, or doing of nothing, with that which is spent in idle employments or amusements, that amount to nothing. Sloth, by bringing on diseases, absolutely shortens life. Sloth, like rust, consumes faster than labour wears, while the used key is always bright, as Poor Richard says. But dost thou love life? Then do not squander time, for that's the stuff life is made of, as Poor Richard says. How much more than is necessary do we spend in sleep, forgetting that the sleeping fox catches no poultry, and that there will be sleeping enough in the grave, as Poor Richard says. If time be of all things the most precious, wasting time must be, as Poor Richard says, the greatest prodigality, since, as he elsewhere tells us, lost time is never found again, and what we call time enough always proves little enough. Let us then up and be doing, and doing to the purpose, so by diligence shall we do more with less perplexity. Sloth makes all things difficult, but industry all easy, as Poor Richard says, and he that riseth late must trot all day, and shall scarce overtake his business at night, while laziness travels so slowly that poverty soon overtakes him, as we read in Poor Richard, who adds, drive thy business, let not that drive thee, and early to bed, and early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Industry need not wish, and he that lives upon hope will die fasting. There are no gains without pains. He that hath a trade hath an estate, and he that hath a calling hath an office of profit and honour. But then the trade must be worked at, and the calling well followed, or neither the estate nor the office will enable us to pay our taxes. What though you have found no treasure, nor has any rich relation left you a legacy? Diligence is the mother of good luck, as Poor Richard says, and God gives all things to industry. One today is worth 2 tomorrows, and Father, have you somewhat to do tomorrow, do it today. If you were a servant, would you not be ashamed that a good master should catch you idle? Are you then your own master? Be ashamed to catch yourself idle. Stick to it steadily, and you will see great effects, for constant dropping wears away stones, and by diligence and patience the mouse ate in 2, the cable, and little strokes fell great oaks. Methinks I hear some of you say, must a man afford himself no leisure? I will tell thee, my friend, what Poor Richard says, employ thy time well, if thou meanest to gain leisure, and, since thou art not sure of a minute, throw not away an hour. Leisure is time for doing something useful. This leisure the diligent man will obtain, but the lazy man never, so that, as Poor Richard says, a life of leisure and a life of laziness are 2 things. Keep thy shop, and thy shop will keep thee. And again, if you would have your business done, go, if not, send. If you would have a faithful servant, and one that you like, serve yourself. A little neglect may breed great mischief, adding, for want of a nail the shoe was lost, for want of a shoe the horse was lost, and for want of a horse the rider was lost, being overtaken and slain by the enemy, all for the want of care about a horseshoe nail. So much for industry, my friends, and attention to one's own business. But to these we must add frugality. What maintains one vice would bring up 2 children. You may think perhaps that a little tea or a little punch now and then, diet a little more costly, clothes a little finer, and a little entertainment now and then can be no great matter, but remember what Poor Richard says, many a little makes a mickle. Beware of little expenses, a small leak will sink a great ship, and again, who dainties love shall beggars prove, and moreover, fools make feasts, and wise men eat them. Buy what thou hast no need of, and ere long thou shalt sell thy necessaries. If you would know the value of money, go and try to borrow some, for he that goes a-borrowing goes a-sorrowing. The second vice is lying, the first is running in debt. Lying rides upon debt's back. Poverty often deprives a man of all spirit and virtue. 'Tis hard for an empty bag to stand upright. And now to conclude, experience keeps a dear school. But fools will learn in no other, and scarce in that, for it is true, we may give advice, but we cannot give conduct, as Poor Richard says. However, remember this, they that won't be counselled can't be helped, as Poor Richard says, and Father, that if you will not hear reason, shall surely rap your knuckles. The Whistle to Madame Brilliant-Passy, November 10, 1779. I am charmed with your description of paradise, and with your plan of living there, and I approve much of your conclusion that, in the meantime, we should draw all the good we can from this world. In my opinion, we might all draw more good from it than we do, and suffer less evil, if we would take care not to give too much for whistles. For to me it seems that most of the unhappy people we meet with are become so by neglect of that caution. You ask what I mean. You love stories, and will excuse my telling one of myself. When I was a child of 7-year-old, my friends, on a holiday, filled my pocket with coppers. I went directly to a shop where they sold toys for children, and being charmed with the sound of a whistle that I met by the way in the hands of another boy, I voluntarily offered and gave all my money for one. I then came home and went whistling all over the house, much pleased with my whistle, but disturbing all the family. My brothers and sisters and cousins, understanding the bargain I had made, told me I had given 4 times as much for it as it was worth, put me in mind what good things I might have bought with the rest of the money, and laughed at me so much for my folly that I cried with vexation, and the reflection gave me more chagrin than the whistle gave me pleasure. This, however, was afterwards of use to me, the impression continuing on my mind, so that often, when I was tempted to buy some unnecessary thing, I said to myself, don't give too much for the whistle, and I saved my money. As I grew up, came into the world, and observed the actions of men, I thought I met with many, very many, who gave too much for the whistle. When I saw one too ambitious of court favour, sacrificing his time in attendance on levees, his repose, his liberty, his virtue, and perhaps his friends, to attain it, I have said to myself, this man gives too much for his whistle. When I saw another fond of popularity, constantly employing himself in political bustles, neglecting his own affairs and ruining them by neglect, he pays indeed, said I, too much for his whistle. If I knew a miser who gave up every kind of comfortable living, all the pleasure of doing good to others, all the esteem of his fellow citizens, and the joys of benevolent friendship, for the sake of accumulating wealth, poor man, said I, you pay too much for your whistle. When I met with a man of pleasure, sacrificing every laudable improvement of the mind, or of his fortune, to mere corporeal sensations, and ruining his health in their pursuit, mistaken man, said I. You are providing pain for yourself. Instead of pleasure, you give too much for your whistle. If I see one fond of appearance, or fine clothes, fine houses, fine furniture, fine equipages, all above his fortune, for which he contracts debts, and ends his career in a prison, alas, say I, he has paid dear, very dear, for his whistle. When I see a beautiful, sweet-tempered girl married to an ill-natured brute of a husband, what a pity, say I, that she should pay so much for a whistle. In short, I conceive that great part of the miseries of mankind are brought upon them by the false estimates they have made of the value of things, and by their giving too much for their whistles. Yet I ought to have charity for these unhappy people, when I consider that, with all this wisdom of which I am boasting, there are certain things in the world so tempting, for example, the apples of King John, which happily are not to be bought, for if they were put to sale by auction, I might very easily be led to ruin myself in the purchase, and find that I had once more given too much for the whistle. Adieu, my dear friend, and believe me ever yours very sincerely and with unalterable affection, B. Franklin. A letter T.O. Samuel Mather Passy, May 12, 1784. Rev. Sir, it is now more than 60 years since I left Boston, but I remember well both your father and grandfather, having heard them both in the pulpit and seen them in their houses. The last time I saw your father was in the beginning of 1724, when I visited him after my first trip to Pennsylvania. He received me in his library, and on my taking leave showed me a shorter way out of the house through a narrow passage which was crossed by a beam overhead. We were still talking as I withdrew, he accompanying me behind, and I turning partly towards him, when he said hastily, "Stoop, stoop." I did not understand him till I felt my head hit against the beam. He was a man that never missed any occasion of giving instruction, and upon this he said to me, "You are young, and have the world before you. Stoop as you go through it, and you will miss many hard thumps." This advice, thus beat into my head, has frequently been of use to me, and I often think of it when I see pride mortified, and misfortunes brought upon people by their carrying their heads too high. B. Franklin, Theend Bibliography. The last and most complete edition of Franklin's works is that by the late Professor Albert H. Smythe, published in 10 volumes by the Macmillan Company, New York, under the title The Writings of Benjamin Franklin. The other standard edition is The Works of Benjamin Franklin by John Bigelow, New York, 1887. Mr. Bigelow's first edition of the autobiography in 1 volume was published by the J.B. Lippincott Company of Philadelphia in 1868. The life of Franklin as a writer is well treated by J.B. McMaster in a volume of the American Men of Letters series, His Life as a Statesman and Diplomat, by J.P. Morse, American Statesman series, 1 volume, Horton, Mifflin Company publish, both books. A more exhaustive account of the life and times of Franklin may be found in James Parton's Life and Times of Benjamin Franklin, 2 vols, New York, 1864. Paul Lester Ford's The Many-Sided Franklin is a most chatty and readable book, replete with anecdotes and excellently and fully illustrated. An excellent criticism by Woodrow Wilson introduces an edition of the autobiography in the Century Classics, Century Co., New York, 1901. Interesting magazine articles are those of E. A. Hale, Christian Examiner, LXXE, 447, W. P. Trent, McClure's Magazine, IA, 273, John Hay, The Century Magazine, LXXE, 447. See also the histories of American literature by C. F. Richardson, Moses Coit Tyler, Brander Matthews, John Nichol, and Barrett Wendell, as well as the various encyclopedias. An excellent bibliography of Franklin is that of Paul Lester Ford, entitled A List of Books Written by or Relating to Benjamin Franklin, New York, 1889. The following list of Franklin's works contains the more interesting publications, together with the dates of first issue. 1722. Dogood Papers. Letters in the style of Addison's Spectator, contributed to James Franklin's newspaper and signed Silence Dogood. 1729. The Busybody. A series of essays published in Bradford's Philadelphia Weekly Mercury, 6 of which only are ascribed to Franklin. They are essays on morality, philosophy, and politics, similar to the Dogood Papers. 1729. A modest inquiry into the nature and necessity of a paper currency. 1732 to 1757. Prefaces to Poor Richard's Almanac. Among these are Hints for Those That Would Be Rich, 1737, and Plan for Saving £100,000 to New Jersey, 1756. 1743. A proposal for promoting useful knowledge among the British plantations in America. This paper appears to contain the first suggestion, in any public form, for an American Philosophical Society. Sparks. 1744. An account of the new invented Pennsylvania fireplaces. 1749. Proposals relating to the education of youth in Pennsylvania. Contains the plan for the school which later became the University of Pennsylvania. 1752. Electrical Kite. A description of the famous kite experiment, first written in a letter to Peter Collinson, dated Oct. 19, 1752, which was published later in the same year in the Gentleman's Magazine. 1754. Plan of Union. A plan for the union of the colonies presented to the Colonial Convention at Albany. 1755. A dialogue between X, Y, and Z. An appeal to enlist in the Provincial Army for the defense of Pennsylvania. 1758. Father Abraham's Speech. Published as a preface to Poor Richard's Almanac and gathering into one writing the maxims of Poor Richard, which had already appeared in previous numbers of the Almanac. The speech was afterwards published in pamphlet form as The Way to Wealth. 1760. Of the Means of Disposing the Enemy to Peace. A satirical plea for the prosecution of the war against France. 1760. The interest of Great Britain considered with regard to her colonies and the acquisitions of Canada and Guadeloupe. 1764. Cool Thoughts on the Present Situation of Our Public Affairs. A pamphlet favouring a royal government for Pennsylvania in exchange for that of the proprietors. 1766. The examination of Dr. Benjamin Franklin, and so on, in the British House of Commons relative to the repeal of the American Stamp Act. 1773. Rules by which a great empire may be reduced to a small one. Some 20 satirical rules embodying the line of conduct England was pursuing with America. 1773. An Edict of the King of Prussia. A satire in which the King of Prussia was made to treat England as England was treating America, because England was originally settled by Germans. 1777. Comparison of Great Britain and the United States in regard to the basis of credit in the two countries. One of several similar pamphlets written to effect loans for the American cause. 1782. On the Theory of the Earth. The best of Franklin's papers on geology. 1782. A letter purporting to emanate from a petty German prince and to be addressed to his officer in command in America. 1785. On the Causes and Cure of Smoky Chimneys. 1786. Retort Courteous. Sending Felons to America. Answers to the British clamour for the payment of American debts. 1789. Address to the public from the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting Abolition of Slavery. 1789. An account of the Supremest Court of Judicature in Pennsylvania, viz. The Court of the Press. 1790. Martin's account of his consulship. A parody of a pro-slavery speech in Congress. 1791. Autobiography. The first edition. 1818. Bagatelles. The Bagatelles were first published in 1818 in William Temple Franklin's edition of his grandfather's works. The following are the most famous of these essays and the dates when they were written. 1774. A Parable Against Persecution. Franklin called this the Li chapter of Genesis. 1774, A Parable on Brotherly Love. 1778, The Ephemera, an Emblem of Human Life, a new rendition of an earlier essay on human vanity. 1779, The Story of the Whistle. 1779, The Levee. 1779, Proposed New Version of the Bible, part of the first chapter of Job Modernized. 1779, published, The Morals of Chess. 1780, The Handsome and Deformed Leg. 1780, Dialogue between Franklin and the Gout, published in 1802. 1802, A Petition of the Left Hand. 1806, The Art of Procuring Pleasant Dreams. Transcriptions of newspaper pages, page 1 of the Pennsylvania Gazette. Num. XLTHE, Pennsylvania Gazette, containing the freshest advices, foreign and domestic. From Thursday, September 25, to Thursday, October 2, 1729. The Pennsylvania Gazette being now to be carried on by other hands, the reader may expect some account of the method we designed to proceed in. Upon a view of Chambers's great dictionaries, from whence were taken the materials of the universal instructor in all arts and sciences, which usually made the first part of this paper, we find that besides their containing many things abstruse or insignificant to us, it will probably be 50 years before the whole can be gone through in this manner of publication. There are likewise in those books continual references from things under one letter of the alphabet to those under another, which relate to the same subject, and are necessary to explain and complete it. Those are taken in their turn may perhaps be 10 years distant, and since it is likely that they who desire to acquaint themselves with any particular art or science would gladly have the whole before them in a much less time, we believe our readers will not think such a method of communicating knowledge to be a proper one. However, though we do not intend to continue the publication of those dictionaries in a regular alphabetical method, as has hitherto been done, yet as several things exhibited from them in the course of these papers have been entertaining to such of the curious who never had and cannot have the advantage of good libraries, and as there are many things still behind, which being in this manner made generally known, may perhaps become of considerable use, by giving such hints to the excellent natural geniuses of our country, as may contribute either to the improvement of our present manufactures or towards the invention of new ones, we propose from time to time to communicate such particular parts as appear to be of the most general consequence. As to the religious courtship, part of which has been retailed to the public in these papers, the reader may be informed that the whole book will probably in a little time be printed and bound up by it, self, and those who approve of it will doubtless be better pleased to have it entire than in this broken, interrupted manner. There are many who have long desired to see a good newspaper in Pennsylvania, and we hope those gentlemen who are able will contribute towards the making this such. We ask assistance, because we are fully sensible that to publish a good new paper is not so easy an undertaking as many people imagine it to be. The author of a gazette, in the opinion of the learned, ought to be qualified with an extensive acquaintance with languages, a great easiness and command of writing and relating things cleanly and intelligibly, and in few words, he should be able to speak of war both by land and sea, be well acquainted with geography, with the history of the time, with the several interests of princes and states, the secrets of courts, and the manners and customs of all nations. Men thus accomplished are very rare in this remote part of the world, and it would be well if the writer of these papers could make up among his friends what is wanting in himself. Upon the whole, we may assure the public that as far as the encouragement we meet with will enable us, no care and pains shall be omitted, that may make the Pennsylvania Gazette as agreeable and useful an entertainment as the nature of the thing will allow. The following is the last message sent by His Excellency Governor Burnett to the House of Representatives in Boston. Gentlemen of the House of Representatives, it is not with so vain a hope as to convince you that I take the trouble to answer your messages, but, if possible, to open the eyes of the deluded people whom you represent, and whom you are at so much pains to keep in ignorance of the true state of their affairs. I need not go further for an undeniable proof of this endeavour to blind them, than your ordering the letter of Messrs. Wilkes and Belcher of the 7th of June last to your Speaker to be published. This letter is said, in page 1, of your votes, to enclose a copy of the report of the Lords of the Committee of His Majesty's Privy Council, with His Majesty's approbation and orders thereon in council, yet these gentlemen had at the same time the unparalleled presumption to write to the Speaker in this manner, You will observe by the conclusion what is proposed to be the consequence of your not complying with His Majesty's instruction, the whole matter to be laid. Page 4 of the Pennsylvania Gazette, turfitted, but those of 13D. And it is remarkable that all attempts of this kind upon the paper money of this and the neighbouring provinces have been detected and met with ill success. Custom House, Philadelphia, Entred Inwards, Sloop Hope, Elias Nordane, from Boston, Sloop Dove, John Howell, from Antigua, Bricked, Penswood, Thomas Brayley, from Madeira, Entred Outwards, Schooner John, Thomas Wright, to Boston, Bricked, Richard and William, Weavey Mail, for Lisbon, Ship Diligence, James Bailey, for Maryland, cleared for departure, Ship London Hope, Thomas Annis, for London, Ship John and Anna, James Shirley, for Plymouth. Advertisements. To be sold by Edward Shippen, choice hard soap, very reasonable. Run away on the 25th of September past, from Rice Pritchard of Whiteland in Chester County, a servant man named John Cresswell, of a middle stature and ruddy countenance, his hair inclining to red. He had on, when he went away, a little white short wig, an old hat, drugget waistcoat, the body lined with linen, coarse linen breeches, grey woolen stockings and round-toed shoes. Whoever shall secure the said servant, so that his master may have him again, shall have £3 reward and reasonable charges paid by Rice Pritchard. Run away on the 10th of September past, from William Deweese of Germantown Township, in Philadelphia County, a servant man named Mechbisdar Arnold, of a middle stature and reddish curled hair. He had on, when he went away, a good felt hat, a dark cinnamon-coloured coat, black drugget jacket, mouse-coloured drugget breeches, grey stockings and new shoes. Whoever secures the said runaway, so that his master may have him again, shall have 20 shillings reward and reasonable charges paid, by me, William Deweese. Lately reprinted and sold at the new printing office near the market. The Psalms of David imitated in the language of the New Testament and applied to the Christian state and worship by I. Watts, VDM, the 7th edition. N.B. This work has met with such a general good reception and esteem among the Protestant dissenters in Great Britain and see whether Presbyterians, Independents, or Baptists, that 6 large impressions before this have been sold off in a very short time. The chief design of this excellent performance, as the author acquaints us in his advertisement to the reader, is to improve psalmody or religious singing, and so encourage and assist the frequent practice of it in public assemblies and private families with more honour and delight. Yet the reading of it may also entertain the parlour and the closet with devout pleasure and holy meditations. Therefore he would request his readers, at proper seasons, to peruse it through. And among 340 sacred hymns they may find out several that suit their own case and temper, or the circumstances of their families or friends. They may teach their children such as are proper for their age, and by treasuring them in their memory they may be furnished for pious retirement, or may entertain their friends with holy melody. Lately imported from London by Joher Lay, and are to be sold by him at the lowest prices, either by wholesale or retail, at his shop in Market Street, over against the Presbyterian Meeting House, these goods following, viz. Calicoes, divers sorts, hollands, and several sorts of sheeting linen, several sorts of diapers and tablecloths, several sorts of cambrics, mantua silks and grassets, berylin and plain calamenco, tammy yard wide, men's dyed chamois gloves, women's ditto, lamb, stitching silk, thread and silk, twist for women, silk and ribbons, double thread stockings, men's white chamois gloves, silk handkerchiefs and other sorts of handkerchiefs, men's glazed gloves, topped, men's shoe buckles, bath metal, masks for women, several sorts of penknives, plain metal buttons for men's coats and jackets, ivory case, knives and several sorts of pocket knives, dowlasses several sorts, huckerbags and Russia linen, Osnaburgs, several sorts of looking glasses, garlics and brown holland, bag holland ditto, several sorts of druggets, fine kerseys, superfine double-milled drab, broadcloths, London shalloons, fine and coarse hats, men and women's English shoes, stockings, several sorts for men, women and children, several sorts of caps, women's bonnets, several sorts of horn and ivory combs, gunpowder, shot and flints, Bibles of several sorts, testaments, psalters and primers, large paper books and small ones with pocket books and other stationery ware, several sorts of checkered linen, flannels and duroys, Scots snuff. To be let by the above person, one half of the house he now possesseth, inquire of him and no further. Bibles, testaments, psalters, psalm books, accompt books, bills of lading bound and unbound, common blank bonds for money, bonds with judgment, counterbonds, arbitration bonds with umpeerage, bail bonds, counterbonds to save bail harmless, bills of sale, powers of attorney, rights, summons, apprentices, indentures, servants' indentures, penal bills, promissory notes, ASAC. All the blanks in the most authentic forms, and correctly printed, may be had at the publishers of this paper, who perform all above sorts of printing at reasonable rates. Very good live geese feathers to be sold at Even Powell's in Chestnut Street, next door but 1-2 Andrew Hamilton, Esk. Just published, Titan Leeds Almanac for the year 1730 in his usual plain method, being far preferable to any yet published in America, to be sold by David Harry at the late printing office of Samuel Keimer, at 3 shillings and 9 pence per dozen. N.B., as this almanac for its worth has met with universal reception, it has raised the price of the copy to 25 a year, for which reason the printer cannot afford them under the above-mentioned price, but gives this friendly caution to the public that when they buy almanacs for 3s a dozen they must not expect Titan Leeds's, or any so valuable. Speedily will be published Godfrey's Almanac for the year 1730, containing the lunations, eclipses, judgment of the weather, the spring tides, moons rising and setting, suns rising and setting, length of days, 7 stars rising, southing and setting, time of high water, fairs, courts, and observable days, fitted to the latitude of 40 degrees and a meridian of 5 hours west from London. Beautifully printed in red and black, on one side of a large demi-sheet of paper, after the London Mariner. To be sold by the printers hereof at the new printing office near the market for 3s per dozen. Philadelphia, printed by B. Franklin and H. Meredith at the new printing office near the market, where advertisements are taken in, and all persons may be supplied with this paper at 10 shillings a year. First page of the New England Courant, Neo 19, The New England Courant, from Monday, December 4, to Monday, December 11, 1721, on Sylvia the Fair. A jingle. A swarm of sparks, young, gay and bold, loved Sylvia long, but she was cold, interest and pride the nymph controlled, so they in vain their passion told. At last came Dalman, he was old, nay, he was ugly, but had gold. He came and saw, and took the hold, while t'other beau their loss condoled. Some say, she's wed, I say, she's sold. The letter against inoculating the small pox, signed Absinthium, giving an account of the number of persons who have died under that operation, will be inserted in our next. Foreign Affairs. Ispahan, March 6. The conspiracy formed by the Grand Vizier last January was 12-month, with design to make himself King of Persia, was seasonably discovered, and himself and accomplices secured, since which the state hath enjoyed its former tranquillity, and a new Vizier is appointed in his room. The old one's eyes being both put out, he is kept alive, but in prison, to make him discover all his riches, which must be immensely great. Since they found in one of his chests 400,000 Persian ducats, beside foreign coin, and in another place abundance of jewels, gold and silver, and so in proportion among several of his accomplices, by the help of which treasure they hope to compass their ends. Tripoli, July 12. As soon as our squadron fitted out against the famous before Gianur, Kogia, appeared off Dasna and Bengen, with 2,500 Moorish horse and 1,000 foot, and skirmished a little with his squadron, he abandoned both those places, and fled to the island of Serbi in the territories of Tunis. But the Bai of that place having denied him shelter, he sailed farther away, in a French bark, we know not whether. And his own galleys and barks are gone after him, so that we are now entirely rid of that troublesome guest. Our rovers keep all in port, for fear of the Maltese. Cadiz, Aug. 12. The floater is expected home from the West Indies before the end of this month. 13 pieces of cannon and 2 mortars were lately sent from hence to Ceuta. The 3 Spanish men of war of 50 to 60 guns each, which carried the Spanish cardinals to Italy, are now at Alicant. It is said they are to join the Dutch vice admiral, who is now in this bay with 4 ships of his squadron of 50 guns each, and cruise against the Algerines. Wheat and barley being very cheap in these parts, great quantities have been sent lately to the Canaries, where for some time past the inhabitants have been in great want of corn. On the 9th instant died Mr. Charles, His Britannic Majesty's Consul at St. Lucas. Bernay, Aug. 20. The deputies of this canton who went to the Diet at Frauenfeld are now assembled at Baden with those of Zurich and Glaris, to regulate certain affairs relating to the town and county of Baden, which formerly belonged to the 8 eldest cantons, but in the last Swiss war was given up to Zurich and Bern in propriety, with a reservation to the canton of Glaris, which is mostly Protestant, of the share it had before in the sovereignty of that district. The 3 deputies of Zurich, Lucerne and Siuri, who were commissioned by the late General Diet to go to Wilchingen, to try to compose the differences which have been long standing between the inhabitants of that place and the canton of Schaffhausen, whose subjects they are, have offered those inhabitants a full pardon for all past misbehaviour and the maintenance of their privileges for the future, provided they forthwith return to their duty. But it is advised that those of Wilchingen persist hitherto in this disobedience. Schaffhausen set. 1. They write from Italy that the plague is no longer observed at Marseilles, Aix, and several other places, and that at Toulon it is very much decreases, but alas, how should it be otherwise when the distemper hath hardly any objects left to work upon? At Arles it is likewise abated, we fear for the same reason. Meanwhile, it spreads in the Gevaudan, and 2 large villages in the neighbourhood of Fréjus were attacked the beginning of this month. The French court hath prohibited all communication with the Gevaudan upon severe penalties. The plague is certainly got into the small town of Marvig in that district, which town is shut in by 800 men. Letters from Geneva say the 2 battalions employed in surrounding La Canorgue are infected, and that Mages is very much suspected. The Marquis de Quelus had retired to a castle near Avignon, but the sickness being got among his domestics, he was fled farther away. Paris, set. 5. The district over which the Duke of Berwick is to have the command extends to the borders of the Bourbonnois, and the court puts a great confidence in the care of that general to hinder the infection from spreading. The Marquis de Versailles is actually drawing lines to shut in the Gevaudan, and 12 regiments of foot, and as many of dragoons, are marching to reinforce the troops already posted on that side. The plague seems to have almost spent itself in Provence. Though it is yet a great way off of us, men talk nevertheless of laying up magazines of all sort of provisions here, and of making 20,000 beds to be set up in the hospitals and tennis courts. Hague, Sept. 9. The deputies of our Admiralties had, last Saturday, an extraordinary conference with those of the States General upon the spreading of a report that 10 or 12 persons died daily at a certain place in Normandy, which was therefore suspected to have received the contagion, but upon the matter it doth not appear there was the least foundation for such a report, though it is too plain the distemper gains ground space in the southern parts of France. We can by no means penetrate into the designs of the Tsar, who, notwithstanding 'tis confidently written that the peace between him and Sweden is as good as concluded, hath a fleet of 30 men of war and 200 galleys at sea near Åland. However, an express gone by from Stockholm doth not confirm. End of transcriptions.